when genius becomes a threat. Society's fear explained. Imagine this: a child in a classroom, no older than 10, who questions the teacher not out of rebellion, but out of a sincere desire to understand. He's not trying to be smart, he's just aware. He sees the gaps in the logic, the contradictions in the system, the cracks in the rules that others follow without question. The teacher calls it disruptive. The classmates roll their eyes. The parents are told he's difficult. But what if, really, what if that child is not a problem to be fixed, but a mirror to a society that doesn't know how to handle brilliance? We live in a world that celebrates genius in theory but punishes it in practice. And the reason is as old as civilization itself. Genius is unpredictable, uncontrollable, and deeply inconvenient for the structures we've built to keep us comfortable. Think about it. The same society that idolizes Einstein in textbooks would have labeled him as a failure in real terms. He was a terrible student. He didn't conform. He questioned everything. And yet, we hold him up today as a symbol of human potential. So why do we so often reject the genius when it's in front of us?
Click subscribe to this channel to get more topics you love.
Here's the uncomfortable truth. Genius threatens the status quo, and the status quo is what makes most people feel safe. It's a shield of predictability in a chaotic world. It gives people roles, rules, and rhythms. But genius doesn't play by those rhythms. It hears another beat altogether, one that others can't even detect yet, and that's precisely why society reacts with fear. Not because the genius is wrong, but because they might be right too soon. Let me ask you, have you ever had a moment where you saw something clearly, painfully clearly, before everyone else did? Maybe it was a toxic relationship that no one else wanted to call out. Maybe it was a flaw in a plan everyone applauded. Maybe it was a truth about yourself that no one was ready to hear. How did people respond? Did they thank you for your insight? Or did they distance themselves, mock you, or tell you to just let it go? We're taught, subtly but persistently, that blending in is safer than standing out, that going along with the crowd is wiser than confronting it. But genius doesn't blend, it illuminates. And light, when it's too bright, makes people squint. It exposes things they weren't ready to see, and that exposure, that's the real threat. Here's where it gets even deeper. The fear of genius isn't just about intellect, it's about identity. Because when someone challenges the norms, the unspoken rules, the silent agreements we've all made just to keep things normal, we're forced to confront the possibility that we've been wrong. And most people would rather demonize the genius than confront the discomfort of their own limitations. Think about Socrates. The man spent his life asking questions, not giving speeches, not writing books, just asking questions. And for that, he was sentenced to death. Why? Because questions, real ones, are dangerous. They tear at the fabric of certainty. They make people uncomfortable. He didn't wield power. He didn't raise an army. He just asked too many inconvenient questions, and that was enough. Now zoom out. Look at history. How many visionaries, artists, mathematicians, inventors, musicians, how many of them were mocked, outcast, or worse, simply because they saw the world differently, and how many of them were only celebrated after they were gone? That's not coincidences. That's a pattern. and it tells us something profound about human nature. We don't fear the genius because they're wrong. We fear them because they might be right, and we're not ready for what that means. So if you're someone who's been told you think too much, feel too deeply, ask too many questions, maybe that's not a flaw. Maybe it's a gift. But it's a gift wrapped in resistance. And the first resistance you'll meet is not from the world, but from yourself. Because you've been trained all your life to avoid being too much, too intense, too curious, too strange. But what if those very qualities are the signs of latent genius? What if your discomfort around the ordinary is not a dysfunction, but a signal? What if your dissatisfaction with the status quo is not rebellion, but revelation? We have to start reclaiming the idea that being different is not dangerous, but necessary. That pushing boundaries is not a transgression, but a contribution. That the world doesn't evolve by consensus. It evolves through the courage of the few who dare to see things differently. Here's a question for you to wrestle with. In what ways have you been taught to hide your genius? And what would happen if you stopped hiding? The architecture of fear. Why society builds walls around genius. If we want to understand why genius becomes a threat, we have to look not just at individuals, but at the systems, structures, and institutions that surround them. Society doesn't just fear genius passively, it actively builds mechanisms to contain, suppress, and often neutralize it. These mechanisms are subtle. They don't come with warning signs. They come dressed in politeness, in bureaucracy, in tradition. But make no mistake, they are walls. And those walls are built from fear. Fear of instability, fear of the unknown, fear of losing control. Let's start with education. The very place where young minds are supposed to be nurtured and expanded is often the first place where genius is suffocated. Why? Because schools are designed for efficiency, not brilliance. They are calibrated to the average, not the exceptional. When a child moves too fast, asks too many questions, or refuses to fit the mold, the system doesn't stretch to accommodate them. It snaps back to correct them. Stay in your lane, it says. Follow the curriculum. Don't overthink it. But what is genius if not the refusal to stay in predefined lanes? The educational system was never built to cultivate genius. It was built to produce predictability, and predictability is the enemy of innovation. Think about how many brilliant minds were labeled as problems, as failures, as distractions, when in reality they were simply misplaced. They weren't broken. The system was, and still is. But it doesn't stop at education. The workplace, politics, media, these are all arenas where conformity is rewarded and deviation is punished, not because people are malicious, but because systems are designed to protect themselves. And genius, by its very nature, disrupts systems. Let's take a step back and look at the psychological undercurrent here. When someone expresses a radically new idea, something that challenges the way we see the world, it forces us into cognitive dissonance. And cognitive dissonance is uncomfortable. It creates a tension between what we believe and what we're seeing. And instead of resolving that tension by updating our beliefs, most of us resolve it by dismissing the source. We say, he's crazy, she's unrealistic, they're just being difficult. That's easier than saying, maybe I need to rethink my worldview. This psychological reflex is not just individual, it's collective. Societies develop immune systems just like bodies do. And genius can look like a virus to those systems. It spreads ideas that infect the status quo. It questions assumptions that hold institutions together. It asks, what if we're wrong? And that question, repeated enough times, can collapse entire empires of thought. So what does society do? It inoculates itself. It marginalizes the genius. It labels them as eccentric, dangerous, or irrelevant. They become myths or monsters, never mentors. And yet, every major leap in human progress has come from those very outcasts. Galileo, imprisoned for suggesting the Earth revolves around the sun. Tesla, ridiculed and bankrupted even as he gave the world electricity. Van Gogh, dismissed as insane, selling only one painting in his lifetime. These were not anomalies, these were prophets. But prophets without pulpits. Because the systems they challenged were too invested in their own survival to listen. So here's the question. If society has a beginner resistance to genius, how does anything ever change? The answer is both simple and profound. Courage. Not just the courage of the genius, but the courage of those around them, the few who are willing to listen before the world is ready. The mentors, the allies, the quiet believers who say, I see what you see, even if I don't fully understand it yet. And maybe that's the role we all have to play. Not everyone is born a genius, but everyone has the power to recognize it, to support it, to protect it from the machinery that would crush it, because genius alone isn't enough. It needs space to grow. It needs resistance, yes, but not annihilation. It needs dialogue, not dismissal. So I want to ask you something. Have you ever dismissed someone too quickly just because they made you uncomfortable? And more importantly, have you ever dismissed yourself? Because the walls society builds around genius don't just keep others out, they keep you in. They whisper things like, don't speak up, don't be weird, don't dream too big. And those whispers become beliefs, and those beliefs become prisons. But what if you could unlearn them? What if the very thing you've been suppressing, the question, the idea, the perspective, was your quiet genius trying to speak? Would you listen this time? The burden of being early. Why genius feels like isolation. There is a unique kind of loneliness that genius carries. Not because it is superior, but because it often arrives early, before the world is ready, before the language even exists to explain what it sees. Genius is not just having a brilliant idea, it's being able to perceive a truth that others can't yet comprehend, and that temporal gap, the space between vision and validation, is where isolation begins. Imagine standing in a room filled with people who speak a language that's almost but not quite your own. You try to communicate something important, something urgent, but your words land with confusion or disinterest. You start to doubt yourself. You wonder if you're making sense at all. This is what it feels like to be early. To see the shape of a truth that others haven't yet even begun to recognize. This kind of isolation isn't just social, it's existential, because when no one else can see what you see, you start to feel like you don't belong anywhere, that maybe you're broken or delusional or lost. And the tragedy is, many geniuses believe that, not because their ideas are false, but because the silence around them is too loud. The absence of feedback becomes a form of rejection, and rejection over time seeps inward. It becomes self-doubt. It becomes a slow erosion of the very flame that genius is built on. the courage to believe in your own insight. But let's ask an honest question here. Have you ever had a thought that felt too big for the moment you were in, an insight that nobody else seemed to understand, so you buried it? That burying, that internal exile happens quietly and often, and it usually starts in childhood. A child asks a profound question, what happens after we die? Or why do people lie if they say they love each other? And adults brush it off. You'll understand when you're older, they say. Don't worry about that now. But that child did understand, at least part of it, and that part deserved to be seen, not silenced. This is how we teach genius to hide, not with cruelty but with neglect. We don't punish it, we ignore it. And genius, like any living thing, cannot survive long without attention. It either goes dormant or turns inward, becoming bitterness or arrogance or despair. And here's the paradox. The earlier you see something, the longer you may have to wait for others to catch up. That means genius often feels like a curse before it ever feels like a gift. You're not just ahead, you're alone. And the world doesn't meet you with open arms, it meets you with confusion, suspicion, or even hostility. No one likes being made to feel small or behind, and when your very presence, your thoughts, your questions, your clarity makes others feel that way, they will instinctively push you away. So what do? Do you shrink yourself to fit? Do you pretend not to know what you know? Do you slow yourself down just to be accepted? Many do. They choose safety over truth, acceptance over authenticity. But genius, real genius, cannot be tamed for long. It either finds a way to express itself or it consumes the person from the inside. That's why so many brilliant people spiral into depression, addiction, or madness, not because they're unstable, but because they're isolated. They're carrying truths too heavy to hold alone, and no one has shown them how to share the load. That's not a personal failing, it's a societal one. So here's a challenge. If you've ever felt that burden of being ahead, of being misunderstood, don't turn the volume down. Learn to channel it. Find others who speak your strange language, or at least who are willing to learn it, and, if you can't find them yet, be the one who speaks clearly anyway, because every great shift in history started with someone who was willing to be misunderstood. Let me ask you this, what part of yourself have you silenced because the world wasn't ready to hear it? The redemption of genius, turning isolation into illumination. So here we are, standing at the edge of the most important question of all. What happens after the isolation? What happens when the genius, weary from misunderstanding, decides not to vanish into silence, but to transform that solitude into light? Because that ultimately is the redemption of genius. Not in being understood, not in being praised, but in being useful, in taking what it saw in solitude and offering it to the world, even if the world still isn't ready. Genius, when it's mature, learns to stop craving validation. It stops waiting for applause. It realizes that its power isn't in being accepted, it's in being of service. The real genius doesn't just invent or theorize or create, it translates. It takes what it saw alone on the mountain and brings it back down to the village. It finds metaphors, stories, technologies, frameworks, anything that can help others see what it saw, not for ego, but for evolution. And this is where the pain of being early becomes the power of being a guide. Because once you've lived through the darkness of alienation, you understand how desperately others need light. And not just brilliant light, but gentle light. Light that doesn't blind, but warms. This is the turning point, the moment when genius stops being a threat and becomes a beacon. But this transformation is not automatic. It requires wisdom. It requires humility. It requires the genius to stop trying to be right and instead try to be helpful. That's the difference between the immature genius who isolates themselves in bitterness and the evolved genius who becomes a teacher, a builder, a healer. Not because they've diluted their vision, but because they've refined their delivery. We often associate genius with intellect, but the highest form of genius is not just intelligence, it's compassionate clarity. It's the ability to see deeply and still choose to connect, to know that you could rise above, but instead you reach down. That's what the world really fears, not just brilliance, but brilliance with love. Because that combination is unstoppable. It doesn't just challenge the system, it redesigns it. So how do you get there? How do you turn your isolation into illumination? First, you must fully accept the loneliness that comes with genius, not as a punishment, but as preparation. Silence isn't the absence of connection, it's the space where clarity is born. Use it. Listen to it. Let it refine your vision. The most powerful truths often come in whispers, not shouts. Second, you must resist the temptation to harden. Bitterness is the armor of the misunderstood. It feels protective, but it only isolates you further. Instead, allow your pain to soften you. Let it teach you how others feel when they're lost, confused, or afraid. That empathy becomes your bridge. Third, learn to speak in many tongues, not literally, but philosophically. Learn the language of science and poetry, of logic and feeling, of certainty and doubt. Because people don't hear with their ears, they hear with their hearts. And if you want to reach them, you have to meet them where they are. Finally, realize this: your genius is not yours alone. It was never meant to be. It's a gift you were entrusted with for the sake of others. The ideas you carry, the insights you feel, the visions you've glimpsed, they're not accidents, they're assignments, and the world needs them. So I want to leave you with one final question. Not a rhetorical one, but one that might change everything. What truth have you been carrying in silence that the world is finally ready to hear? Because maybe, just maybe, you are the genius we've been resisting, and maybe it's time for you to speak.